everybody. My name is Elizabeth Peterson. I'm the director of the museum here at Oglethorpe, and I'm really happy to have a friend of mine come down from my old stomping ground, Eastern Connecticut State University, Gail Gelburd, to talk with you tonight. And you can tell it's going to be kind of a tongue-in-cheek and fun discussion, Snowplows in Havana. I think that would have been funnier if we were still having the 84-degree weather we were having over the last 2 weeks. But, you know, we will make do. Gail has been with Eastern Connecticut State University as a professor of art history since 2001. And I had run a private traveling exhibition company for many years, and for about 12 years she was the director of the museum at Hofstra University. She is the person who helped me start to teach, which I thank her for very much, and teaches museum studies. She's got a wealth of expertise in Japanese studies and Cuban studies, and has been to Cuba many, many, many times, and is going to talk to you this evening, and I'm very glad she came down. Thanks, Gail. Oh, I also want to mention quickly that our last lecture is with Dr. Marr, and it's next Wednesday night, so please come to that as well.
You're going to be my...
I'm going to be my person.
All right, you want to put on the first one? I just wanted to say, just a little introduction before I start, is that I was attracted to Cuba at first because I was interested in African American art and I was interested in Asian art, all contemporary. And then I found out that Cuba had both. So I thought I would go see what the art was like. Someone had invited me. This was in 1992 during the Tom Special period. And found this amazing work that was there, and one of the things that struck me, which is what I'm going to talk about today, is the use of irony in much of the art, and we'll talk a little bit about why, and the fact that it was a special period and there was very few supplies available in the traditional sense. And one of the things I always admire about Cuban people is their ability to make do with nothing and make something out of very little sometimes. Part of when you talk about Cuba, you sort of can't avoid talking about the fluctuating storms of American and Soviet politics, which have shifted as the wind shifted over years, as the embargo shifts and things like that. So I always like to start with a picture of the old American cars, which are sacred in Cuba, and one of those things that are really kept and maintained, versus down here is a bunch of the Soviet cars that kind of get run into the ground and thrown out. So there's always been kind of this love-hate relationship. I titled the talk Snowplows in Havana because I think a story that enough people have told me it's true that I believe it, but it could also be a myth, is about the snowplows in Havana. And the story goes that soon after the revolution, a Cuban was sent to the Soviet Union to get bulldozers. And instead of coming back with bulldozers, he came back with snowplows. And of course, so what are you going to do with a snowplow in Havana? Next slide. And some say actually they were used for this. This is what is, I should say was, because last time I was in Havana, I was very disappointed to see there are no more camels. These are called their camel buses, and you can cram a lot of people into them. And some people said that actually when the snowplows came back, that's what started the issue of creating these camels, because they could use these heavy-duty bulldozers to then trail the buses along with it. So I bring this by way of introduction to show you how the Soviets kept importing things into Cuba, and the Cubans would figure out how to use it in a better way, in another way. So we go to the next one. So if we move over to the art, one of the first things that the Soviets wanted to import was the use of Soviet socialist realism. And I'm going to try to force myself to read my notes, otherwise I'll be talking here for 4 hours. But with the Soviet Union as their only major ally, the Cuban government began to acquiesce to the pressures of creating a Soviet-style system. and with it came a wave of repression. The Soviet Union sent Russian teachers to Cuba, but also exerted influence on the Cuban government to manipulate the arts and to force everyone to create realist work which heralded the worker, as we see this Russian piece here. This Soviet-style system was imported to Cuba just at about the time that also, soon after, I should say, the Cuban Revolution. Next slide, please. The Russians, and this, I'm sort of going back and forth a little bit between Russia and Cuba here. The Russians were so insistent on only Soviet socialist-style realism that when artists tried to do abstract art, they literally sent them to mental institutions, firebombed some of their studios, and literally it was against the law to create anything but Soviet socialist-style realism. This is what they were trying to import to Cuba. But what happened was a group of artists, because artists are going to paint what they need to paint. It's like needing to eat or drink water. If you're an artist, you have to do it, even if it makes no sense. So the artists who were abstract artists kind of congregated, shared each other's work, and decided that they would have an exhibition outside for everyone to see. And this was the Bulldozer exhibition in Russia in 1979. And what they did was they set up fences and they brought their art. They all came in at a point in time to show their work, but somehow word had gotten out, as happens in that kind of society, nothing is really secret, and the Soviet militia driving bulldozers this time, not snowplows, driving bulldozers came and literally were running over the art and artists. Fortunately, just so I don't leave you on that story, the artists were smart enough to have a New York Times reporter there, who reported on it, and suddenly the Soviets, of course, said, no, it wasn't about that, we'll let them have an exhibition and things like that. And it began to loosen things up a little bit. But throughout that whole period, Cuba was being subjected to the opinions of the Soviet Union and the pressure that they were putting on because they were their only ally at that point. And the next one. So this is the Cuban answer to Soviet socialist realism. If we look at a piece like this by Rene Francisco Rodriguez and Eduardo San Juan, this is actually now in the National Museum, you can see where we still have an image of the worker, but the worker, of course, is the artist, and we see where he's transformed it into a paintbrush as the worker. So we can see here how they're taking that image of realism and adding satire and irony on it to critique the revolution. The Cuban artist's response would be to satirize the Soviet socialist realism and to use irony to make a commentary on the official notions of what art should be in the society. These two artists worked together for quite a while, they work separately now, to create these visual commentaries. Another one of their collaborations, can we see the next one? Took a painting like this, which is another very typical Soviet socialist realist painting with a portrait of Lenin, and next one. And you can see that they took the Soviet socialist realism and now overlaid it with what might be a Malevich or an abstract work. So that this way they transform it and shows how the abstraction and the freer work can overwhelm that. But this was, again, their way of doing what was required, Soviet socialist realism, but with our own twist about it. Next one. Oh, I'm sorry, go back to the It should be, no. Just this. Oh, I could have just pressed it. I'm sorry. Go back to that one. Okay, transfer to the wall. Okay. Just wanted to read a quote from Han Wan. And I had the pleasure of interviewing many of these artists that we're seeing here today, so most of my quotes are directly actually from them. Censorship, this is what Conrad 1 stated to me. Censorship always exists. It's not something that works sometimes and not other times. I think that censorship is always there. If you pass the limits, the censorship is there. If you get right to that point but don't pass the limit, it seems that there is no censorship. Ironic images then allowed them to get right up to that line and yet not quite pass it, which allowed them to continue making their work. Okay, another exhibition that I have to reference, because you sort of can't talk about the history of Cuban art in any way, contemporary Cuban art, without talking about this exhibition called Volume 1. On January 14th, 1981, 11 Cuban artists, most of whom were students at ISA was the graduate art school, joined together to break through physical and aesthetic barriers in order to present this exhibition. This would be the first major exhibition of the artists who had been born during the Revolution, which is a key point. These are artists who grew up with the Revolution, developed with the Revolution. Refusing to abide by any dictates of imagery, such as Soviet socialist realism, doctrine, or aesthetics, they proclaimed that they were true Marxists, true revolutionaries. Ruben Torres Yorca spoke of how they had been taught to study, to question. On the other hand, they, the government, believed that they had to trust this generation to do the right thing because they were their children, and who else could produce the art and literature of the revolution? So they were using that to try to turn it on the government and say, hey, look, we are your children. We were raised with everything that the revolution taught, so you have to trust us that what we're doing and that revolution is about new and free expressions, and that's what they were trying to get at. Among some of them that we're going to look at, also Flavio Garcia, a couple of the artists that we're going to look at were part of this Volume 1, and this still remains kind of a key hallmark in changes in the art form in contemporary Cuban art. Okay, next one. Another important statement that came out, and Alejandra has a piece that relates to it, which I didn't put in because I figured you talked about it in your piece, the Revolution one, is the 1976 Cuban Constitution had returned the emphasis to doctrines based on Marxist-Leninist policies versus Soviet policies. And there's a big difference. There's political people who know and can talk about it more than me. But that's a big difference between the two, at least according to Cuba. It also stated that it, quote, deems that artistic creation is free as long as artistic content does not express views contrary to the revolution. So Fidel Castro's famous statement of the period is, within the revolution, everything, outside, nothing. Does anyone know exactly what that means? Exactly. It left a lot of confusion. It didn't mean that they weren't telling you had to do Soviet socialist realism. The content, we don't. So here you can see these artists sort of playing with the inside, outside Cuba. We have workers, sort of American versus Russian, and where is Cuba in between here in the outside, inside. Many artists within the revolution were caught in this quagmire of contradictions, and it was difficult to know just what was inside and what was not. Next one. The most influential faculty member at the art school and the teacher who really inspired and facilitated Volume 1 was Flavio Garcia. He began working in a super realist style, which I didn't bring in, but when they said realism, he went to super realism. So that was kind of his response to it as well. I thought these are even more fun. He began working in a super realist style. Oh, I said that. He then turned to create a multiplicity of styles where he appropriated signs, symbols, styles, popular culture, and kitsch. Although the American magazines were not officially allowed into Cuba, they certainly made their way into some people like Flavio Garcia. I know every time I went, I had to bring American art magazines too. His work of the 1980s appropriated iconographic symbols from the Soviet Union. His images of the hammer and sickle, which you can kind of see here, covered with glitter or placed on black velvet, broke the barriers of traditional Cuban art. Garciandia transformed these symbols of the Soviet regime, you can see, into genitalia, implying sexual activity other than that of the approved activities of the Soviet worker. Garciandia called the piece Tropical Kitsch, Communist Paradise. Next one. His appropriation, you can sort of start looking for the sexual imagery. His appropriation of this Soviet, not Marxist, and there's a differentiation, symbology came during the days of perestroika. The reduction of the hammer and sickle to kitsch and sexual imagery is a deconstruction of the power that it symbolized, which is what he was trying to cut down. Although the Cuban government accused Garciandia of inappropriate use of political symbols, unquote, he did receive a key position at the art school when they began replacing Soviet art professors with Cuban artists. Garciandia showed his students that all avenues of expression should be open to all artists. He and his colleagues believed that a work of art was successful if it took the viewer beyond its finished appearance to see in the work of art the essence that was implied. And the next one. In order to understand how art fit into the context of society, Garciandia and his colleagues interpreted a variety of Marxist theoretical texts as well, to show that it's not for the government to determine the viability of art in society, and he was trying to see how far he could push it. If, as Marx suggested, real objectivity comes not from detached contemplation, but engagement in the struggle to transform the world, these artists consciously participated in the struggle. Unlike the rigid Stalinist approach, to be realistic did not mean copying images, nor use of pure ideology. So their realism was the use of real symbols. They believed that it was essential that art also contained the human struggle to transcend the human experience. So this ironic use of the hammer and sickle was a way to transcend human experience and participate in the struggle against tyranny and forces limiting freedoms in Cuba. I think in this one you begin to see a little bit more of the sexual connotation. Yes? I don't have to point that out. Yes, these are on black velvet with glitter. Okay? So it's sort of this pop version of the hammer and sickle, and then of course the hammer and sickle work very well as male and female genitalia. Some of them get very explicit, but I think for this one especially you kind of get the idea, which was also saying something about what he thought of the Soviet Union as well. Next one. Jose Tarak, which you have, I think, one piece in the show. It's a little bit different than the ones I'm going to show you. The ones in the show, he's very influenced by Gerrit Richter. There's a whole other series he did, the grade paintings. But I want to show you the ones which were appropriating images. And I love the way he kind of transforms accepted images. He said he worked with images of public domain, or as he says, quote, with photographs that had already passed through the process of censorship. I worked on the content with a sense of irony. I didn't change the image, I changed the context. In other words, he changed this context in order to say something new about the image that was already accepted, so that no one could censor the work because the photograph was already accepted, although we'll see that it does get censored. His paintings of 1992 were copied directly from photographs in a newspaper. Tarak used the images that already existed and blended them with subtle humor to reveal more than what meets the eyes. So this looks like a very typical photograph, so you'll see it is. He archived images from the press, history books, and magazines, which became references for his art. Tarak used the manufacture of idealistic images to represent the revolution he points out the irony of when fiction becomes fact. So let me explain that a little bit more. Raul Corrales' photograph of Fidel preparing for the revolution in the Sierra Madre Mountains, for example, was actually taken after the revolution. Turak entitled his reinterpretation of the images as 1960, the date when Raul Corrales actually took the photograph, a year after the Cuban Revolution. He said, it's a reflection on how politics has abused photography for its own purpose. They were all meant as political propaganda, but it doesn't mean that it was an image documenting reality. People see the images, but don't read the text, and that is why they work as propaganda. This is an emblematic image of the 60s, and it's one that everyone's seen and knows. There are postcards of it and everything, and it's about, the troops coming into Havana. That's what it's generally referred to. It represents a group of farmers coming to the city because Fidel was going to give them land. This is the original event that happened in 1959. But the pictures were taken by Perfecto Romero. He wasn't a good photographer. He wasn't a military. He was just a military man with a camera. Since he was close to Che, he took some documented pictures, but they weren't very good or aesthetically pleasing. So they wanted to make this book about the revolution. So they needed to recreate the scene from the moments the farmers came to Havana. But it's a fake photograph. It's not about the revolution. At that time, it was more important to have their 15 minutes of fame and to be in the media. It was more important, as they would say, to be filmed than to live in reality. Next one. Turak would play with many of the images that sort of you see all over in Cuba. As I said, you see postcards, you see posters, things like that. He found ways to creatively work within the restrictions and yet continued to push the boundaries of political and social acceptability. His message is meant to engage the viewer in a dialogue, which is the power of his work. So he wanted people to talk about the fact that in the other photograph he called it 1960, and people, wait a second, the revolution was 1959, and he engages in dialogue. The same thing with this, where he took a very famous poster, which was also a posed photograph, and then created his own post photograph. Next one. This is a remake of the Greek, but it has it in English. So he was very influenced by Magritte's portrayal of images. Those of you that know his this very famous painting, and this was a play on it, which basically, of course, this is not a pipe. It's a painting of a pipe. And what he was trying to do was, like this painting and the portrayal of images, is to give the image new content, new meaning. Turak did another painting, and unfortunately with a lot of Turak's work, because it wasn't allowed in the country and he could get in trouble if I photographed it, so some of these things I have to describe still. So one of the things he did as a takeoff of Magritte's portrayal of images is that he did a painting of potatoes. And it was a painting of potatoes, but of course this was done during a special period when there was really a lack of food and things like that. But the only cute potatoes that could be found were in the painting, and certainly were not painting potatoes that could soothe the hunger of Cuban people during what's euphemistically called the special period. So he would just do these paintings of potatoes and hand them out so people could have potatoes, but of course, try to eat a potato. That's the painting. Next. Okay, one of my favorite of his series is a series of images that incorporated ads into imagery. And so this is an image, obviously, of Fidel, or as we call Castro, in Cuba they say Fidel, riding a horse, is transformed when the world's Marlboro and cigarettes' red logo are added. Fidel becomes the Marlboro Man. The powerful image of Fidel is transformed through this image, and this is as consumerism is beginning to come into Cuba and there are debates about consumerism. There basically are no ads in Cuba. It's sort of, I have to explain that because, like, I know when I've taken students there, they suddenly realized there were no billboards, there were no TV commercials, there's no advertising. The only billboards are political ones. So he's playing with this notion of American advertising and this, and of course making it adapt. This was not able to be shown. It was done in the 90s. In 2000, it was shown in a photo gallery in Cuba. It wasn't allowed to be photographed per se or taken out of the country. In fact, when this appeared, in one other one, in the book that I think is out there, Holly Block's book, New Art of Cuba, she was forbidden to go back to Cuba. She had been going very regularly like I had, and we know each other, and basically she got to Cuba and they wouldn't accept her visa, and she only, I guess it's about 10 years later now, last year she was able to go back. She sort of wanted to make the point that she could go back, but because they photographed this. Can I have the next one? Some of the other images that he creates, this one, he has a whole series about obsession, and this one you see he's holding up a newspaper about a plot to kill Castro, which was an obsession that everyone was always trying to kill him, as he would talk about that. There's other ones. There's one of Fidel speaking into a multitude of microphones before an unseen crowd or press, serving as electronics, and he's known for speaking very long speeches. And underneath it says Sony. Or we can see Eternity, Calvin Klein, which of course goes, will be there forever, so it seems. Okay, next one. And this is another one. Does anyone know what Trump is? It's actually the largest manufacturer of fabricating equipment. Okay, so kind of the spoof on this, but this is also from a very famous picture of when Camilo Cienfuegos and Fidel are riding into Havana. This Jeep is a bigger picture of the whole thing, but now again he's transformed it with the word Trump underneath it about fabrications. Next one. This one was a long quote from him, so I put it in here. He said, "These are the rules, those are the rules of the game, and I like to play clean, even though the institutions play dirty with the artists. I have a rule that the artists have to play clean, and if they can't be exhibited, I prefer to show them when it's possible." That's why he was willing to wait on those pieces, even though I wanted to smuggle them in my suitcase. It is also the kind of strategy I use as an artist. I don't do alternative art, but I don't make government art. I'm convinced that in art, time has the final say. Time is the hardest test, and an artist has to overcome it. Everything is about being patient. I don't think there's value in a censored artist. That is no guarantee that your work is good. That's why I try to realize art and show it. The artist's responsibility is not only to produce work, but to go further, show it to the public, and take the risk. So it's a matter of time. Some things I have I can't show at the moment. I'm sure they will be shown someday. Maybe I won't see it. Maybe my son or grandson. Who knows? Okay, next one. Okay, so we have another one which somewhat deals with this issue of, at some point maybe they'll be seen. This is Lázaro Saavedra. And he was a student of Garcia and Torak, the two other artists I showed you, and really also turned to ironic imagery to portray his social reality. And as far as I know, Torak and Saavedra are still in Cuba. I think they are. Garcia. Anyway, Saavedra survived the lack of materials in the special period of the 90s and faced potential isolation as many of the other artists actually left Cuba. The ideology detector was shown at his personal exhibition in the 4th biennial in 1991. And you can see here, it's a little bit hard, unfortunately, this image is pixelated. But with it, basically, it never moves. It has wires and things like that, but everything's subversive. So the ideology detector was shown. The exhibition was closed after only being briefly opened to the public. A year later, the controversial piece was bought by the National Museum. Most people believing it was bought by the National Museum to be squirreled away into storage and never be seen again. It was in 2008, I didn't write down the date, that actually he had a one-person exhibition at the Museo Nacional, and the piece was brought out and put on display. It was the first time it had been shown since the 90s. So it's kind of a play with it back and forth. So it's kind of that getting up to the line. Are you crossing it? And the satire and irony helps you to do it. One of his most famous images is the next one. This is his own flesh and bones, and of course it's a portrait of Karl Marx, and trying to sort of pull away the fact that this hero of communism is, in the end, only flesh and bones. He tries to make the point that he's not a god, and he's also only just a person. This has been reused in many, many different ways. Next one. Another one which is fun, and he does these installations and things like that. He's still in Cuba, but he's had quite a few shows. He just had a show in Boston. He's had a show in another part of Massachusetts at different points. So he's had a few shows in the U.S. This is a series of birds, and if you look very carefully, they're all perfectly in a row like they're supposed to be. But one thing is missing for the birds, their heads, right? So the lead bird carries their heads. And most of his works tend to be kind of subtle, like this. There's one I love he did as an installation, and it was a bunch of puppets. This notion of Cuban people being forced to be puppets. And it was a performance piece. So you walked into the gallery, and there were all these puppets hanging on strings. And then Lazaro just went around and cut the strings. So, of course, all puppets fell to the floor. Next one? Next one? Okay, and one other one of his. This is another earlier piece that he did, which gets back to this notion of this sort of conflicting American and Soviet being forced on you. So what I love, this is kind of an image of Christ with a Cuban heart, because as many of the Cuban artists will tell you, your heart is still Cuban, no matter where you are. But he's being forced to speak Russian, Soviet, Marxism, and dreams of America, which is so many of them. And again, this relates to the references of Castro's statement inside and outside Cuba as well. This is another piece by, a couple of pieces by Lazaro. He does these, I call them, this is my term, Lazarito. Right? It's kind of this little cartoon-like figure that he uses, and kind of talks here about Fidel is dead or resigned versus the internet is shit. And he kind of plays with these things, but as the professional artist that you see, he does sculptures and installation. This allows him to get away with doing a lot of sort of not so serious artists. Or the next one.
I'm just going to read this. Does it say, whoever raises their hands can have the internet, whether they have no arms?
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to translate it.
This one too is the eye. The eye is round. He's got a square there as well. There's another one that I love. What I was talking before about, again, something I have an image of though, is Fidel's speeches go on and on and on, and he loved to play with that as well. So he has this tapes, you know, the old-fashioned magnetic tapes, and they're just swirled all around, and there's a fan going. And the tapes just keep getting wound and wound, and in the background, all you hear is Fidel's speeches. But he did get a one-person show in the Museo Nacional. And part of that may, in fact, be because he has stayed in Cuba. He goes, he does exhibitions, and he comes back. Or this one is a more recent piece, next one. This one is at, there's the catalog there for the big show that was in Montreal, and this was at the show. This is a 4-channel video he created, sort of making fun of the arbitrary nature of censorship, and that one is always looking. So you can see that this is him looking in all different directions, looking to see who is watching him, and then arbitrarily one gets censored. Next one. Keep going because I talked about that. Another artist that I wanted to show you, this is Fernando Rodriguez, who creates this alter ego called named Francisco de la Cal. This is so much fun. There's so many pieces that he does. I think he's still in Cuba too. This is called The Proud Farmer, and I have the detail of it over here. He's a simple man, enthusiastic patriot, who went blind in the early 60s. This is Francisco de la Cal I'm talking about, which is the persona that Fernando Rodriguez created. Okay, so you can see our artist sometimes creating these other personas in order to say the things that he wants to do. So you find a lot of things with puppets and things like that. Someone else can say it, and you can get away with it. He went blind in the early 60s and believes today that all of the goals of Cuban Revolution have been fulfilled. Fernando sees himself as the visual translator and mediator for Francisco de la Cal of the experience and dreams of this fictitious character. The contradiction of Cuba today versus what in the 60s people imagined it might be. We look a little deeper, the work is a little less ironic. It centers around the fact when there was the chronic lack of foodstuff and other goods in Cuba, a farmer could make very good money. Because of this, he has privileged social status and is far better off than an intellectual, for example. And that's why the poop from the rooster is gold, because he's a farmer. And then there's all kinds of other things I won't get into about what a rooster represents and stuff. Okay, another one. Next. Okay. Another Francisco de la Cal. He did a whole series, and actually there are 3 panels. I'm just showing you one of them, which is Fidel Castro with the Virgin del Cobre. And we see very often different artists have put them in compromising position. He puts them instead in a wedding situation. So that we see here that he shows the Virgin appears in her role as patron saint. And other artists have dealt with that very often as well. And what we see then in the back, Francisco de la Cal, the blind artist in the background, is writing his name, because on the back there, wall over there is actually the names of many, many other artists as well, who have had to stand by and kind of watch this marriage of the Fidel and the Virgin. Next one. This is Los Carpinteros. I'm just showing a couple of others, and then I'm going to get to one key point here. This was a painting done to represent the American Country Club. And when supposedly revolutionaries went into the American Country Club, which was supposedly very beautiful at the time, it was all overgrown and in bad shape. And Fidel and Che decided that they would play golf on it. And also at that time decided that, which was a great thing, that it would be turned into an art school. And did become ISA, the graduate art school that I mentioned is there. There was also supposed to be other schools, some of which were never built. But this is actually the three artists, which is a group from Los Carpinteros. And so they are on the grass, all overgrown, kind of reproducing Che and Fidel, but of course the golf clubs are now just sticks. Next. Or Sandra Ramos. I don't have to get too explicit about these, but the notion of wanting the almighty American dollar, and you can see this is kind of Alice in Wonderland with George Washington in a compromising position, or over here George Washington in his boxer shorts as well. Next. Another artist is Stereo Segura. A couple of these are some more recent artists. There's been a lot about going, trying to get out of Cuba and come to the United States, and how do you do that? And in the 90s was called the Balseros, the rap people. So Stereo Segura came up with this idea that he was going to take one of those great American cars that are so preserved, and he was going to turn it into a submarine. And then you could get a whole bunch of people, and they could go across the straits to Miami. I actually volunteered to go with him in it. But I said, oh, wouldn't that be cool that an American shows up on the shore? I have a passport, right? Although maybe that wouldn't be such a good idea. I don't want to lose my passport. But so he actually did, this was the original drawings. He actually did construct it. It was actually at the last Havana Biennale. And he did go in the water with it. I didn't go with him. I said, no, I was just like talking hypothetically. And the water got up to about here, and that was kind of about it. Didn't quite make it its way across to Miami. Okay, next one. Even when the artists come to the United States, I think that whole notion of using whatever materials you can find and transforming it, and that sense of irony still prevails. This is a much younger artist, Pablo Costa, who just recently came from Cuba and now lives in New Jersey. This is called Stolen Art. And because there's a lack of materials and things like that, what he began doing is, you know how when you have a door that needs to be repainted and you scrape it, right? You scrape all the paint off. Well, that's what he was doing for his art supplies. He was scraping the paint off the old doors in Cuba, and there was a lot of old paint. So he would then take them and reconstruct it using the paint chips into paintings. And now since he's coming here, he can actually afford to do it, but he now paints it on glass and then still has to peel off the individual pieces. So since he wasn't stealing the paint anymore, he decided that he should steal the art. So he goes to, now he's in New York, so he's been doing some Metropolitan Museum, he did Louvre. He's doing this whole series where he steals art from the different museums and recreates it with the sort of stolen paint. So actually this whole thing is little tiny paint chips, the whole thing, to recreate the art. And it's actually done on sheetrock, and it looks like it's been ripped out of the wall as well. So this kind of sense of irony and using what you can come across is something which still continues on. And that sense of irony and using different materials and things like that, I think you can see in this exhibition. And I wanted to put it a little bit into context, then back to the baseball. And the next one. So, to put all this art in context, I need to tell you about one other major event which brought art and irony, baseball, forever together. Just before the collapse of the Soviet Union and the subsequent changes that would define the next decade, and unable to organize another major exhibition, unable to get a permit for a major gathering of artists, which they had been trying to do since Volume 1, a group of artists found a way to subvert the authorities and yet make a powerful, albeit ironic, statement. More than 60 artists, including Ruben Torres Yorca, Flavio Garcia, organized the baseball game as a performance piece. A call went out in the old oral tradition to people involved in the visual arts to come to the stadium to play ball. Since legal permission is required for an art gathering, artists, critics, and professors met at the stadium, which was part of the University of Havana, for a baseball game. Cuba's national pastime, of course, right? Aldito Menendez helped them to print up signs that were distributed around the city. They wore a participant list, the date and the address of the sports center wherever the participants walked, or other people walked. Hundreds of people from the university and art institutions showed up to watch these pathetic ball players, and they really were. There was a large audience, mostly artists and university people. Imagine you get a whole bunch of academic faculty to play baseball, right? So mostly artists and university people, armed with his own beard, because Ruben Torres Yorca had a beard like that. This isn't Ruben Torres Yorca, but you get the idea. Ruben Torres Yorca dressed up like Castro and became the umpire. He called people out when they were safe, and safe when they were out. Well, censorship again, right? At the end of the game, as is custom, the players, remember who are artists, ran around the stadium with a large banner denouncing art and praising sports. The sign said, "Cuban art has decided to dedicate itself to sports." Next one, just to show you the stadium. Aldito Menendez reminded the authorities that this was the game of the true revolutionaries. He stated, "A counter-revolutionary artist criticizes all the problems of the revolution, but does not offer any solutions, because he believes that the only possible solution is to change the political situation. A revolutionary artist criticizes the problems of the revolution and tries to offer solutions because he believes in the revolution. It's not that they were necessarily against socialism, but chose to participate in it by commenting on it and its problems. Raised with a Leninist Marxist philosophy of aesthetics, those Cuban artists who stayed in Cuba or left continued to make critical commentaries by using irony as their weapon of choice, to visualize the contradictions, the goals, the hardships, and the struggle, and yet stay just barely within the boundaries of what was acceptable." Thank you. So, anyone has any questions?
Well, thank you for your talk. It was very ideological in terms of the philosophical perspectives of the artists. And I'm wondering about the aspect of finance, the commodification of art that we see in the United States, how they approach or how they see their work as being something that not just expresses meaning but also produces income and helps them in their actual daily lives.
Well, it's very interesting because for decades, Cuban art was made and pretty much stayed in Cuba. And there was a big controversy because one of the artists, Tomas Sanchez, sold pieces. He was invited to a show in Paris and he sold pieces and he couldn't keep the money because their, education, housing, everything was paid by the government, studio supplies, so that the money was supposed to come back to the government. Well, of course, artists are not going to necessarily want to keep producing art if they can't keep any of the money for it. So the reality is that many artists left Cuba as soon as they began to have some connections outside. The Cuban government realized that they were losing all of their best artists. So they struck a deal with many of the top artists that the artists could keep whatever they sold overseas. They could keep like 50%, is how it started. It kept changing many times, but 50% of what they sold, which many of them complained to me how horrible that was, that the government kept 50%. And I said, the government is giving you exhibitions, the government is sending you off to the biennales and stuff like that. If you had a gallery takes 50%. So really wasn't that much difference. The reality is that as soon as the first time I went to Cuba in '92, everyone wanted to know, how do I get a gallery? I go, oh my God, you sound just like everyone in the United States. But they had never had any of that concept whatsoever, and they all wanted to know, how do I get a gallery? How do I get a gallery? I go, well, if I had the answer to that, how everyone gets a gallery. So I said, you have to do your research, you have to look it up, you have to pound the pavements, and look. So two of the artists, Stereo Segura, I showed you briefly here, and another one, Carlos Aijaco, very good friends of mine, they came to New York right out of grad school. They pounded the pavement. They went to get shows. They pounded the pavement to get galleries. They stayed wherever they could. They had no money. They had nothing. One of them ran up my phone bill. He still owes me. And they began selling. And a lot of these artists, like Stereo Segura, is one of the top-selling artists in Cuba nowadays, lives mostly in Spain. Sandra Ramos, whose prints I showed you briefly, she's extremely successful as well. Many of these artists became extremely well off, actually, as they began, because since no one had seen Cuban art before, it was a big deal, and everyone wanted to see Cuban art. So it began to have shows and be exhibited, and a lot of people made a lot of money. Unfortunately, and this is my own personal view, is sometimes when artists make a lot of money, they lose that creative spirit because they want to make art just to make money. And unfortunately, I think that in Cuba, when it's so difficult, the artists there today are trying to do what they can so that they can make art that sells. Which in one sense, I can't blame. Everyone wants to sell their art so that you can, survive. So they've become like the rest of us. Where before it was coming from, I think, a very pure place because they weren't worrying about money per se. Then they joined the rest of the world and been trying to sell their art. Does that answer your question? Anyone else? Yeah?
Yeah, maybe it's kind of follow up actually to that question. It strikes me, listening to you, that in some ways, living in a society that has very specific forms of repression in terms of censorship and creates an artistic environment in which going up to that edge is itself both kind of excellent in terms of content, but also in terms of a sort of a communicative style that it's very fertile for the artist on the one hand. On the other hand, it strikes me that other than that one move, using irony and really being able to press and really engage the fundamental sort of ideological tensions and the contradictions in society, in some ways it kind of funnels art to be speaking constantly about society in a very specific and in a way that's not entirely because it's responding against the Soviet, it's in dialogue with the Soviet, which makes it a bit Soviet-ish, in a sense. So it seems like there's kind of an odd tension, even, and it speaks, I think it's a little bit of a follow-up because those artists then that kind of want to go make money and maybe break out of always doing art that's Cuban art, even though it sells, but that's being commodified. So it seems like they're in a kind of a double bind in a way. And I don't know if it's really a question, but I thought maybe you could speak to it.
Yeah, well, I think also the thing is that, one would have to think then, okay, if it's kind of anti-Soviet, well, the Soviet Union's gone at this point, so.
Right.
But anti-Cuban, in a sense, well, but there's this double-edged sword because on the other hand, people see this work all over the world and go, Cuba can't be that oppressive if they let this out, right? And they're promoting that, it was a point where Cuba had the highest literacy rate in the world. And people that, I actually had this opportunity to speak to the Minister of Finance, who actually had studied at Harvard. And I spoke to him, and he said, well, our three key exports is art, music, and education. I guess I would say doctors too, because they send a lot. Unfortunately, I'm talking about 10 years ago. Things have radically changed. But, so I think that they saw it as a way of exporting, that they are this intellectual, sophisticated, creative culture, and that they're not that oppressive because they let this out. So some people would say that the artists were actually doing the bidding of the Cuban government. So, it's kind of this double-edged sword is, if you do art like this, they're making comment on it, but on the other hand, being shown in an exhibition where you're representing the Cuban government becomes sort of difficult. And many of the artists struggle with these things. On the other hand, if you're an artist and you're getting exhibitions all over the world and you're making money, it's kind of hard to say, no, I'm afraid that I might be helping the Cuban government. I don't want to do that. Anyone else?
Well, did the realist painters, were they government-employed painters that did the Soviet realism and made good money doing it, or?
In the Soviet Union?
Well, in the Soviet period in Cuba.
Well, in Cuba, the Soviet artists were the teachers. And they were brought in
I see. Okay.
to teach the Cubans how to
I
paint.
see, so they were Soviet, they were
Yeah.
Russian.
But Cuba had a fantastic history of modernism with Fray Lam and people like that. There's wonderful collections in the Museo Nacional. So they had a much more, and there was a lot of Cubans that went and studied in Paris. So they had a whole tradition, and they weren't, most of the artists were not about to just give in and listen to these Soviet artists, which is ultimately the Cuban government, this isn't working, and began to have some Cuban artists working.
How do other Cubans view their artists? Do they see them as being stars? I know that.
How do Cubans see the Cuban artists?
Yeah, because in the introduction, it was mentioned that you're interested in Japanese art, and in Japan, the people are very proud of their people who make it overseas, or internationally known. And I wonder if in Cuba also there's a sense of, hey, these are our guys, now they're getting a chance to be shown around the world. This is our art, or is it like that's just some intellectual sport activity that only a few people
No, art in many ways is much more respected in Cuba than it is here. And as a pursuit, as a means of expression. And the reality is that since they see that the artists are making money, everyone in Cuba kind of wants to be an artist. So that you walk all over Cuba, Havana especially, and everyone has turned their, little apartment or on the street or, on different areas you see art all over for sale. And someone from my university was very proud. She came back with this whole collection of Cuban art. And I looked at it more. It was kind of like Haitian primitive art. It was, it was not Cuban. It had nothing to do with the art scene in Cuba or anything else. And she was telling me how great the art was, and I kind of looked at it, and it was someone I couldn't exactly tell what I thought, but the people are bringing it back and say, oh, look at all this great Cuban art, but it's like, anyone will paint anything because if the tourists come in. Remember, we're the only ones not there. There is hordes of tourists from Germany and the Netherlands and Great Britain and Canada. I was on a plane with a banker from Canada. Who's the economics person? And I said, well, what do you think of the American embargo? Because best thing that could ever happen, we hope they never end it. And I go, really? Why? He said, because for once we don't have competition from the Americans. Anyone wants to do business in Cuba, guess what? They have to contact us. You have to go north of the border in order to fly south of the border. It's crazy. And they have direct flights from Montreal and Toronto and to Ontario. I mean, for the longest time when I was first going to Cuba, I just told people that I was Canadian because I got too many questions on how did you get in, why you if I said I was American. So I just said I was Canadian. That's all. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah?
Gail, I just have a quick question. We had a lecture last week about Operation Peter Pan and the idea of trying to get the children out of Cuba during and after the revolution. Was there ever any concerted effort to evacuate earlier cultural treasures of Cuban origin out of the country during the revolution?
Officially or unofficially?
Either.
Well, a lot of people took a lot of things out of the country. Yeah, and a lot of things have shown up. A lot of people went to Puerto Rico, you know, and then to the United States. There's been a lot of controversy that has come up about what was taken, what wasn't taken, forgeries that were made of things, and the Museo Nacional actually redid and has now put more of their permanent collection out to show what they still do have versus the copy that might be sold and stuff. So yeah, it's been very controversial as a lot of people tried to smuggle some of that stuff out.
But the Museo Nacional, did they institutionally try to get things out during the revolution at all, or
To safeguard it.
to safeguard it, or was it just sort of shut down by the revolution and safeguarded?
No, as far as I know, there wasn't any attempt to safeguard or preserve it that way. In fact, one of the biggest advocates of the revolution was Wilfredo Lam, and he donated a lot of work to the museum, and right after the revolution, he went in and created this magnificent painting called The Third World, which he painted right there on the site, and it's still in the museum. So as far as I know, there wasn't any attempt to get it out. It was other people trying to get whatever they could
Right.
out.
In the penultimate slide, there was the picture of the Castro character and H. Chavez. Was that Hugo Chavez, or it's just?
Yeah, that was a more recent picture. That I was just trying to show you what Fidel had looked like in the other one. There is a poster that I located, which I sent you to share, but that I have to, it was one of the posters, and a friend of mine has it, and I've been begging him to photograph it for me, but it's very fragile, so he's kind of reluctant to even open it up to sort of shoot it, and I'm trying to beg him so we have a digitized version of it. So. Okay.
Probably informal after.
Yeah, thank you.